Lesson 52. The supine and its uses. Expressions of purpose. Caesar Book 1, Chapter 3 continued. Hi everyone, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 155. And today we're going to talk about the supine and expressions of purpose. And they're presenting those two things together because the supine actually is one of the ways to express purpose. So let's take a look at the supine here in section 411, also 412 and 413. We've talked about this before, but it bears repeating that the supine is very similar to the perfect passive participle. Let's think about the four principal parts of verbs for a moment. The first conjugation example verb that we usually use is laudo. So laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. Those are the four principal parts. Laudo is first person singular, present tense. Laudare is the infinitive. That is the present tense active infinitive. Laudavi is perfect tense, first person singular, active. And laudatum, that fourth principal part there, in some books they call that the supine, but in some textbooks, the way they list the four principal parts is with the fourth principal part ending in us. So they'll say laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatus. And in fact, that's the way I learned it. When I was in high school and I took Latin for the first time, we would repeat those verb forms over and over. Ambulo, ambulare, ambulavi, ambulatus. And that's just the way I got used to. And so when they do that, what they're telling you is that the fourth principal part is the perfect passive participle in the masculine. So laudatus would mean praised or having been praised for a man. For a woman, it would be laudata. And for something neuter, like a town, it would be laudatum. So that perfect passive participle declines like a first and second declension adjective. Remember that participles really act as adjectives. They're verbal adjectives, as they say. So laudatus, laudata, laudatum. It declines like a first and second declension adjective. And so in some textbooks, that's what they'll give you for the fourth principal part. They'll say laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatus. Of course, they'll just give you the masculine one. It could be that in some books, they'll say laudatus a But then in other books, they give you that fourth principal part ending in and so they'll say laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. And so the first time I saw that, I thought to myself, why are they not giving laudatus there? Why are they giving laudatum? And I thought what they were doing was giving the fourth principal part in its neuter form. So the supine is a verb form that looks exactly like the perfect passive participle, but neuter. If I take the perfect passive participle of laudo and I make it neuter, that's laudatum. And then if I take the supine, that's also laudatum. So they look the same, they're spelled the same. Really, only the context can help you tell them apart. In this particular textbook, when you see the fourth principal part, what that is the supine. So in this particular textbook, they give you the supine as the fourth principal part. And in fact, in section 411, that's what they say. They say the supine has been given as the fourth of the principal parts of verbs. So what is the supine? We know how to form it. We know it looks just like the perfect passive participle, but neuter. So we know that much. But what is it? What does it do? Well, continuing on here in section 411, it says this. It is a verbal noun having two forms, an accusative in and an ablative in long U there with a macron. So the supine is a weird verb form It's like a verbal noun, but it only comes in two forms, just accusative and ablative. You see it occasionally in certain kinds of expressions. Not too often, but it is something you need to know about. Probably the most common way you'll see it is, as described in section 412, with a verb of motion to express purpose. And so that uses the accusative supine, the one that ends with um. Remember, there are only two forms of the supine, ending in and ending in u. That's all you get, it's just two forms. So it's a verbal noun. It acts like a noun, but it's based on a verb. And you can use it in certain kinds of statements and expressions. Let's take a look at two of them here in section 412. If you have a verb of motion, someone coming or going somewhere, you can use the accusative supine along with that verb of motion to show purpose. So let's look at this sentence here. Opugnatum patriam nostram veniunt. Okay, veniunt says they are coming. That's third person plural. And then opugnatum is an accusative supine. That's a form of the verb opugno, which means to capture or storm or take by storm or attack, things like that. So veniunt being a verb of motion, someone going somewhere, and then opugnatum as an accusative supine, those two words together say they are coming for the purpose of attacking. Or in more colloquial English, they are coming to attack. And then it takes a direct object, opugnatum takes a direct object, patriam nostram, our homeland, our country. So that's how the accusative supine can express purpose. A verb of motion plus an accusative supine can express purpose. It's the same as if you just had a purpose clause with ut. Same thing. In part 2 of section 412, we have kind of a rare thing that they want to show us. You really don't see this much in literature. It's pretty rare. You combine the supine with iri. Iri is a form of the verb eo, which means go. That's a fourth conjugation verb, eo, and then the infinitive is ire, I-R-E. And so really what iri is it's the passive infinitive, present tense, of eo. So eo means I go, ire means to go, it's active, and then iri is the passive form of ire. Now you might be asking the question, how do you make a passive form of to go? How does someone go you? Or how does someone make you goad someplace? That doesn't make any sense. If it were up to me, we would probably make the future passive infinitive with maybe, I don't know, a future passive participle plus esse. If it were up to me and I were president of the Latin language, that's how I would probably do it. But that's not the way you do it. Instead, you take a supine and you put it with iri, this passive infinitive form of eo. And when you add that all up, it has the force of a future passive infinitive. The only way I could really explain the grammar would be to say that iri is passive in the sense of impersonal. We've seen impersonal verbs happening with passive verbs like pugnatum est. Pugnatum est meant something like there was fighting or there was some fighting going on. Pugnatum est is perfect tense passive. And notice that that's a gendered verb. And so the gender is neuter. So there is a certain connection between neuter, gender, and impersonal activity. So when you take the neuter gender and you make it passive in the form of a verb, that can have the feeling of impersonal action. So that's the feeling I get here with iri, is it's the idea of there is a going that is happening. It's not personal, like I am going, or I am being transferred somewhere, or I am being goad. That doesn't make any sense, of course. But for me, the idea is there is a going occurring. The activity of going is happening. And then if you think of laudatum as an accusative supine expressing purpose with a verb of motion, because that's what iri is. It's a form of eo, which is a verb of motion. So in that sense, you could think of it as there is a going occurring for the purpose of praising. So keep in mind, this is a very archaic construction. It started out in very early Latin, and I think over time it just became idiomatic. But what it basically adds up to is the idea that a going is occurring for the purpose of doing a thing. So laudatum iri has the idea of a going is occurring for the purpose of praising. And so in that sense, someone is about to be praised. That's about as clear as I can make it. Again, this is very idiomatic. Another thing I would throw in here is the thought that fourth declension nouns, I've been told, oftentimes are formed from the fourth principal parts of verbs. And so a supine, really, it looks like just the accusative singular and ablative singular of a fourth declension noun. For example, exercitus, which means army, that's a fourth declension noun. So in the accusative singular, it would be exercitum, and in the ablative singular, it would be exercitu. So the supine forms look like fourth declension forms, accusative and ablative. You know, the word exercitus is related to the verb exerceo, which means to train or exercise. The four principal parts of exerceo are exerceo, exercere, second conjugation, exercui, exercitum. And so the fourth declension noun exercitus basically is the same as the fourth principal part of exerceo. So it could have started out as a substantive, adjective, a substantive participle, something that's been trained. And so if something's been trained, that could refer to a military group, an army. So there's some kind of connection between the fourth declension and these fourth principal parts of verbs. I've been told in the past that fourth declension nouns oftentimes are just perfect passive participles that have been codified into a kind of a noun form. And so with that in mind, the supine looks an awful lot like the accusative and ablative forms of the fourth declension. Again, a lot of these expressions here are idiomatic and developed over a long time. Scholars can actually look at the way earlier Latin uses these expressions and then notice how they changed over time. For example, Plautus is really some of the earliest Latin we have. Plautus lived in the 2nd century BC, and he wrote lots of Roman comedies. And that's as much as 160 years before authors like Livy, maybe even 110 years before Lucretius, 100 and something years before Catullus. So scholars can look at how Latin style and Latin idiom changes over time. And I think this is one of those things they've noticed that kind of develops over time. So I don't have hard, fast answers for you about how this works and specifically how it gets rendered into English. But what I can do is try to explain the moving parts and the individual parts and try to help you see kind of a big picture of how they might add up into the meanings that they have. That's about the best I can do here. I generally don't like to just say, hey, memorize this, because this means that, and so memorize that and translate it into English this way. I don't like to do it that way because that doesn't really help you understand the Latin language as its own language. That might help you figure out how to translate something into English, but I'm not really interested in learning English. I'm interested in learning Latin. So I want to know what the Latin is actually saying, not merely how to translate it. Translation can be good because that means you can actually express in English what the Latin means. So it can be useful for talking about what the Latin means. But what I prefer to do, instead of having a surface level kind of English rendering, I like to try to dig down and figure out why the Latin means what it means. And that's kind of tough with very idiomatic expressions like the future passive infinitive. Because again, it's idiomatic, it develops over time. Of course, if you're really curious about this, there's a whole world of information waiting for you on the interwebs, as I call it jokingly. There are lots of websites that have lots of old grammar books, lots of discussion groups where people are talking about this kind of thing. And so you can do some additional reading on your own if you're really interested to know more about the nuts and bolts of the supine and the future passive infinitive. Moving on to section 413, let's talk for a moment about the ablative supine. Remember, there are only two forms of the supine, accusative and ablative. And we've covered the accusative one. Now let's take a look at the ablative one. As I mentioned before, it resembles the fourth declension. So the supine one that's ablative ends with the letter U. With the verb facio, you might see the supine factu. And so what factu means is with respect to the doing, with respect to the act of doing. It's like an ablative of respect. So we have an example sentence. Difficile factu est. It is difficult with respect to the doing. Of course, in smoother English, more colloquial everyday English, we might say, it is difficult to do. And that's a good way to translate the ablative supine. But literally, it is difficult in the doing, or it is difficult with respect to the doing, or it is difficult with respect to doing, something like that. So that's not quite as difficult to understand as the future passive infinitive. That's relatively straightforward. Let's move on to section 414, and here we have sort of a recap of the different ways to express purpose in Latin. So let's review these different ways to express purpose, one of which we just learned in this lesson, the supine in the accusative with verbs of motion. So if you want to say for the purpose of in Latin, there are lots of ways to do it. Way number one, you could have a purpose clause with ut, or a negative one with ne. Ut laudem, so that I might praise. Or ne laudem, so that I might not praise. Okay, so ut and ne plus a subjunctive verb, that can give you a purpose clause. Also, earlier in the book, we studied the relative clause of purpose. They explained that to us, saying that when you have a clearly stated antecedent, you can have a relative clause in which the relative pronoun refers back to that antecedent. And then you can have a subjunctive verb in that relative clause. And the idea is that the person is doing whatever is in the relative clause for the purpose of that. So it's a way to express purpose. Number one here lists purpose clauses with ut, purpose clauses that are negative with ne, and then also relative clauses of purpose with a strongly stated antecedent and a subjunctive verb. 2 and 3 have something in common. They both have ad or causa in the ablative. So I can say ad plus laudandum as a gerund in the accusative, and I could say that as for the purpose of praising, or I could have a gerundive. I could say ad milites laudandos, for the purpose of soldiers to be praised. Or in more clear English, for the purpose of praising the soldiers. So that's another way to express purpose with gerunds and gerundives. And then in this lesson, we learned number 4, the supine. You don't need odd with the supine. You just need an accusative supine plus a verb of motion. And we saw that earlier in this lesson. And so here they have kind of a fun exercise at the bottom of page 155. They have a sentence that starts out one way, and then you get to pick from one of 4 different ways to express purpose. It's a good exercise. So mittunt means they send, or they are sending. That's a form of mitto, which means to send. And then orgetorigem is the accusative singular form of the name Orgetorix. So it says, they are sending Orgetorix. And then the second half of the sentence will tell us the purpose. What's the purpose of why they're sending him? And we have 4 different ways to say it. The top one says, ut or qui pacem confirmet. Confirmo means to strengthen or establish. So if we say mittunt orgetorigem ut pacem confirmet, that says they are sending Orgetorix so that he might establish peace. You could also make that a relative clause of purpose. You could have it as qui pacem confirmet, and then it would say they are sending Orgetorix who would establish peace. But it's not simply they are sending Orgetorix who would establish peace in the sense of telling us more information about Orgetorix. The purpose of that relative clause is not to expand upon or tell us more information about Orgetorix. It's to tell us that that's the purpose of why he would be sent. So when you have a subjunctive verb in the relative clause like that, and if you have a clearly stated antecedent, as we do here with orgetorigem, that can add up to a relative clause of purpose. So mittunt orgetorigem qui pacem confirmet, that can say they are sending Orgetorix who would establish peace in the sense of for the purpose of establishing peace. That's the sense of it when the relative clause is constructed in that way. Again, that's called a relative clause of purpose. On the second line, we have ad pacem confirmandum. There we have a gerundive. Ad here means for the purpose of, and then pacem means peace. That's accusative. So ad pacem says for the purpose of peace, and then it's being modified by confirmandum. That's a future passive participle, otherwise known as a gerundive, and participles act as adjectives. So it's modifying or describing pacem. So what kind of peace? It's peace that is to be established. So that one says, they are sending Orgetorix for the purpose of peace to be established. When we translate it into English word for word, it doesn't have a strong English meaning like that. So generally, when we translate it into English, we make the passive activity in the gerundive, we make that active. And then we make the noun the direct object of that activity. So we change it around a little bit. We rearrange the furniture a little bit, and that makes it a bit clearer for English speakers. Literally, they send Orgetorix for the purpose of peace to be established. But a smoother translation for English people, they are sending Orgetorix for the purpose of establishing peace. We flip that around a little bit to make it smoother English. On the next line, another gerundive. Here we have causa in the ablative, meaning for the sake of, or just for the sake. And then paces confirmandi. Those are genitive, so it means of peace to be established. So that one would say, they are sending Orgetorix for the sake of peace to be established. Again, with the gerundive confirmandi, when we translate it into English, we can make that sound more active to make it have more of a stronger meaning in English. So we translate it in a non-literal way. It's actually passive. We make it sound active for a smoother English translation. So literally, they are sending Orgetorix for the sake of peace to be established. But a smoother English translation that's not literal would be, they are sending Orgetorix for the sake of establishing peace. Finally, on the bottom line, we have pacem confirmatum. That looks a whole lot like a supine to me. Confirmatum is an accusative supine. In order for it to express purpose, though, we need a verb of motion. And we have that here with mittunt. When you send someone someplace, that's motion. There's a motion taking place. And so here, what we have is an accusative supine with a verb of motion expressing purpose. So they are sending Orgetorix for the purpose of establishing peace. Pacem is the direct object of the supine confirmatum. Remember that with an accusative supine showing purpose, you don't need ad. You don't need to say ad confirmatum. Just the bare supine by itself communicates purpose, as long as you have a verb of motion along with it. That's the recipe, is a verb of motion plus a supine in the accusative. That's the recipe for how to use a supine to express purpose. So, section 414 was a nice review of some of the different ways in Latin to express purpose. Let's move on now to section 415 and take a look at our vocabulary for this lesson. Perfacilis is an adjective of two terminations. Of course, that's a third declension adjective. Perfacilis is masculine, perfacilis is feminine, and then perfacile is neuter. It means very easy because it's just facilis, which means easy, along with the per prefix, which I've mentioned before. It has an intensifying or strengthening effect. So facilis is easy, perfacilis, very easy. Next, we have a first and second declension adjective, propinquus, propinqua, propinquum. It means near. It's related to prope, which means near. And they have a note here that as a substantive, it means relatives. So in Caesar's Gallic Wars, if you see it talking about someone's propinqui, that could be talking about someone's relatives. Next we have quo, which they're listing here as a conjunction. Really what it is a relative pronoun in the ablative. I suspect that it's neuter, not masculine. And because it's ablative, it's communicating something like because of which, by means of which, by which, with a sense of purpose kind of built into it. And they break it down here. They say ut eo, so that, by that, or something like that. You can see this word in action in exercise 11 down below. It says, they began to fortify the camp, quo facilius. And then it says they might be able to sustain the attacks of the enemies. That's what number 11 says. I'm just giving you a sneak preview here. So the idea is they began to fortify the camp, quo, by means of which thing, by means of which activity, by which activity. So it's literally like they began to fortify the camp, by which activity they would be able more easily to sustain the attacks of the enemy. So we have facilius there as a comparative, and then quo is expressing that the thing they did is going to result in the facilius. Like they began to fortify the camp with the result that they might be more easily able to sustain the attacks of the enemy. So literally, it's by which thing or because of which thing, but it's hard to exactly put it into English. They have meanings here listed in the vocabulary like that thereby, that or in order that. I actually like that thereby. That's kind of, it's archaic, but it kind of works for me. Probably a good literal translation is so that by means of this, because you want to translate it in such a way where you capture the pronoun-y flavor of it and the fact that it's expressing the reason why they're doing a thing. We'll probably use several words to translate that when we get down to number 11. And also, again, we see it in number 12. Moving on, we have frumentor. That's a deponent verb. That means to gather grain. Frumentor, frumentari, frumentatus sum. Those are the principal parts. Gratulor, another deponent verb. That means to congratulate. And this word comes into English with the prefix con. So congratulor, that's where we get congratulate from. Really, it means to experience joy with someone, to congratulate someone. In Latin, we have the noun from the first declension, gratia, which means things like pleasure, grace, thankfulness. You use that term to thank someone. If you say gratias tibi ago, gratias tibi ago means I give out thanks to you, or I do thanks to you. So gratulor means to rejoice, and then congratulor, to rejoice with someone. So when you say I congratulate you, you're basically saying I rejoice with you. Of course, gratulor just by itself can mean to congratulate, but it's especially evident with congratulor, because the idea is rejoicing with someone. That's the force of con. Sometimes the prefix con intensifies a verb and makes it stronger. Other times it means with, and it means you're doing that verb with someone. This is one of those cases where the con means with, congratulor, to rejoice with someone. Populor is yet another deponent verb that means ravage or devastate. I think that our English word depopulate is related to this verb in a kind of a roundabout way. Next we have probo, probare, which is a first conjugation verb. That means to prove, and we see this word in lots of English words such as probation. If you go through a probation period, that's a period in which you have to prove yourself. For example, if you want to join some kind of organization, they might say, well, we'll make you a probational member, meaning that you're a member, but you still have to prove yourself. Or if you get out of prison and they put you on probation, that's a time when you have to prove yourself. You have to prove that you can behave. So probo comes into English in those words. Next we have rogo, rogare. That's another first conjugation verb that means to ask. We have lots of English words with this verb, like interrogation. In the word interrogation, the ROG comes from this word. It's just inter plus rogo. Also words like interrogative. Next we have nubo, nubere, nupsi, nuptum, which means to marry. Of course, we have the English word nuptials. If you say, I'm going to go attend someone's nuptials today, that means you're going to go attend their wedding. And then we have an idiom, conloco nuptum, to give in marriage. It appears that in that idiom, nuptum could be a supine in the accusative, showing purpose. Conloco is to position or station someone, right? So if you position someone for the purpose of them marrying, that's literally what it's saying. You're giving in marriage. So I suspect that nuptum there is an accusative supine with a verb of motion showing purpose. Quaeror, quaeri, questus sum, is yet another deponent verb that means to complain. In English, we have the word querulous, Querulous, which, according to the dictionary, means complaining in a petulant or whining manner. And so that comes directly from this Latin verb, queror. Let's move on now to section 416. That's our translation section for this lesson. Go ahead and turn off the recording and do all the exercises. And then when you're done, turn the recording back on and we'll go through them together. Hopefully by now you've completed your homework. Let's go through the exercises here in section 416 together, starting with number 1. Number 1 says, per facile factu. Per facile means very easy. It's in the neuter gender. Because it's neuter, it could be describing something inanimate, like a plan or an event. And then factu is an ablative supine. Remember that there are only 2 forms of the supine. We have the accusative supine and the ablative supine. And it's kind of an ablative of respect. So it's something like very easy with respect to the act of doing, or very easy with respect to doing. A smoother way to render it into English would be very easy to do. Number 2, est per facile factu. Here we have est being used to mean something like it is. Again, per facile is neuter, so the idea is it is very easy, and the it is referring to some inanimate thing, like a plan, an idea, something like that. And then again, the ablative supine with respect to the doing. So it is very easy with respect to the doing. It is very easy in the doing. Or a smoother English translation, it is very easy to do. Number 3 is next. Id per facile factu esse probat. We have some indirect speech here, or at the minimum, something very similar to indirect speech. Probat here means prove or show. So he, she, or it is showing, or he, she, or it is proving. If you consider that as an act of speech, you could view the next thing that's about to happen as indirect discourse. You could view id as the subject of an indirect statement, and then esse as the infinitive verb. So we could say, he is showing that, and then we go into the indirect statement with the word id, meaning it, as the subject accusative. So he is showing that it, and then esse is the verb. And so that means is, because it's an infinitive, the infinitive of sum. So id and esse form the subject accusative and infinitive of an indirect statement. So number 3 says, he is showing that it is per facile factu, very easy to do. Number 4 is next. Per facile factu esse illis probat conata perficere. This one is a little bit trickier. It still has a similar structure to number 3. Probat means he, she, or it is showing. And then illis is a form of ille, which means that. And it's dative plural. That's the party that something is being shown to. So probat illis will say he is showing to them. And we have indirect speech again with esse as the verb of the indirect speech. But you might be asking the question, what about the infinitive perficere? The idea here is that conata and perficere form a noun clause. Perficere means to do or to perform or to accomplish. And then konata really is a perfect passive participle of the verb konor. Konor means to try or attempt. So if I say konor, that means I am trying or I am attempting. Konari is the infinitive. It's a deponent verb. And then konata means things that have been tried. So it has the idea of being a substantive participle. When it comes to the perfect passive participles of deponent verbs, we don't really call them perfect passive participles because as deponent verbs, they're not passive. We translate them as active. But when it comes to a deponent verb, that perfect participle form, you can use that actually to be passive. I've seen it in texts before. So there's some, leeway with how you can use the perfect participles of deponent verbs. But anyway, to make a long story short, the idea here with konata is that it means undertakings or attempts in the sense of things that are tried, things that are attempted. In the glossary in the back of the book, they are giving us this word as a separate noun, not so much as a substantive participle. They're giving it to us as konatum konati, a neuter noun of the second declension. But they're also saying that it can show up as a fourth declension noun, konatus, konatus. Either way, it means trial or attempt. The idea is it's something you're trying to do, an undertaking, an attempt. So konata and perficere together form a little noun clause. And this is actually a good teachable moment because this is an example of an infinitive really acting as a noun. I've talked several times about the gerund in Latin. In Latin, the gerund only has 4 cases. It's got genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative. And so you might ask the question, well, why doesn't it have a nominative? For example, with the verb laudo, if I want to say of praising, I can say laudandi. If I want to say for praising, I can say laudando. If I want to use praising as a direct object or an object of the preposition ad, I can say ad laudandum. If I want to say by means of praising, I could say laudando in the ablative. So we have genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative. But what about nominative? How would I just say praising in the nominative? And the answer to that question is that the nominative gerund, really, that role is covered by the infinitive. So if I want to just say, praising is my favorite thing to do, if I wanted to make a sentence like that in Latin, I would use the infinitive, that is the present tense active infinitive, laudare, and then grammatically, as a noun, the infinitive would be neuter in gender. So if I wanted to make a sentence like, praising is good, I would say, laudare est bonum. I would use the first and second declension adjective, bonus bona bonum, but I would put it in the neuter to agree with laudare. Grammatically speaking, when you use an infinitive like that, as a noun, grammatically it's neuter. And so the things around it that go with it will need to agree with it, and they'll need to be neuter also. So the nominative gerund in Latin doesn't exist because the infinitive does that. But if you want to say of praising, then you need to have laudandi. So the present active infinitive of a verb, that is doing the role of what a nominative gerund would do. It basically is the nominative gerund. And that's basically what we have here with perficere. Perficere is the present active infinitive of perficio, and it's the subject of an indirect statement. The verb of the indirect statement is esse. So probat perficere and esse together would say, he is showing that to accomplish is. So I guess technically here we're using perficere as a noun in the accusative. So this is a good example of finding a place where somebody is using an infinitive as a noun. We don't even need conata. We could just say, he is showing that to accomplish is blah, blah, blah. But perficere has a direct object, and that's conata. So conata and perficere together say to accomplish the attempts or to accomplish the undertakings. Why don't we say undertakings? That's a good way to translate conata. So conata and perficere together form a little unit, a little thing, which technically is called a noun clause. So conata and perficere together are joined at the hip. They're kind of one unit, and that's the subject of the indirect statement. So he is showing that the act of accomplishing the undertakings, that thing, esse, is. And so that's our indirect statement. Per facile factu means very easy to do. Notice that per facile is neuter because it needs to match the case of the noun clause, conata perficere. The act of doing those undertakings, the act of completing them as a thought, as an idea, as a clause, is neuter. Again, illis, he's showing it to those people. So put it all together, and it reads literally like this. He is showing to those people that to accomplish the undertakings is very easy to do. So we have probat as the main verb. Perficere and conata together form a noun clause. That noun clause is the subject of the indirect statement. Esse is the verb of the indirect statement. So that's how it adds up grammatically. Number 5 is next. Haedui legatos mittunt rogatum auxilium. Here we have a verb of motion working together with an accusative supine to show purpose. So the haedui, that's the subject. Mittunt, they send. And then legatos means envoys or ambassadors. So the first 3 words will say the haedui are sending ambassadors. Mittunt is present tense. Then we have the accusative supine, rogatum. That means for the purpose of asking or to ask. And then auxilium, which means help or assistance. That's the direct object of rogatum. So literally, the haedui are sending ambassadors to ask help or to request help. In English, we throw in the word for and say ask for help. So the haedui are sending ambassadors to ask for help. Number 6 is next. Dumnorix suas propinquas nuptum conlocavit. The subject here is dumnorix. The verb is conlocavit. Conlocavit is a form of the verb conloco, which can mean to assign, to set up, to put together. I think in a military setting it can mean to deploy troops. And then suas propinquas means his relatives. And notice that propinquas has a feminine ending because it's talking about women. So suas propinquas will say his own female relatives. That's really what it's communicating here. So what we have so far, Dumnorix placed his female relatives. Dumnorix assigned his female relatives. Dumnorix set up his female relatives. Something like that. And then conlocavit, along with nuptum, forms an idiom that means to give in marriage. As far as I can tell, nuptum is the accusative supine of the verb nubo. So along with this verb of motion, conlocavit, it can express purpose. So grammatically, here's how it adds up. Dumnorix placed his female relatives for the purpose of marriage. Dumnorix assigned his female relatives for the purpose of marriage. You know, in the ancient world, oftentimes marriages were used to seal diplomatic relationships. If one royal family wanted to connect with another royal family, they could have someone from one royal family get married to someone from the other royal family, and that would connect them by marriage. And so you see this all the time in history, especially in the medieval period. You see it in the ancient Near East, and even in the early modern period, you see arranged marriage among the royal families of Europe. So this is Dumnorix, a Gallic aristocrat, engaging in the practice of arranged marriage. And again, propinquas is a substantive. It's an adjective functioning as a substantive, and it's in the feminine accusative plural, referring to women. So that's how the grammar adds up here. Number 7 is next. Principes civitatem ad Caesarem gratulatum convenerunt. The subject here is principes. That means chiefs, chief citizens, leaders, top people in charge of something, the principal people, in other words. And what did they do? Convenerunt. They came together. That's convenio, which means to come together. So let's translate principes as leaders. So the leaders came together. And then we have civitatum, which is genitive plural. That means of the states. So it's the leaders of the states. And then ad Caesarem says to Caesar, like to Julius Caesar. And then we have an accusative supine expressing purpose, along with a verb of motion. Convenio, to come together, that's a verb of motion. And so you can have an accusative supine working off of that to express purpose. So convenerunt and gratulatum together will say, they came together in order to congratulate, or they came together to congratulate, or they came together for the purpose of congratulating. So number 7 altogether says, the leaders of the states came together to Caesar to congratulate him. And the idea is to congratulate him, not just to congratulate. So we'll translate number 7 like this. The leaders of the states came together to Caesar in order to congratulate him. Number 8 is next. Haedui veniebant questum quod harudes fines eorum popularentur. Here we have yet another accusative supine showing purpose. The haedui, that's the subject. Veniebant means they were coming. That's imperfect tense. And then veniebant is a verb of motion, and it's got this accusative supine working along with it. That's questum, from the deponent verb quaeror, which means to complain. So the haedui were coming for the purpose of complaining, or the haedui were coming in order to complain. That's how the first 3 words will read. And then we have the word quod. I would like to translate quod as because, but as I look ahead, I see that there's a subjunctive verb here, popularentur. That's the verb populor, which means to ravage or devastate. So with this subjunctive verb here, quod feels more like that, almost like a result clause or something like that. So let's translate quod as that. Of course, quod can mean because, but here in context, it just feels more like it means that. As far as how we would render it into English. So what we have so far would say, the haedui were coming to complain because, or that, the harudes were ravaging. Ravaging what? Fines, that means borders, and then eorum means of them, or their. That's a genitive plural form of is, ea, id. So the Haidui were coming in order to complain that the Herodes were ravaging their borders. And we'll translate borders as the collective noun territory. So the Haidui were coming to complain that the Herodes were devastating their territory. Again, notice the subjunctive verb in this clause that starts with quod. Another thing to notice is that we're in secondary sequence here. Winneyabont is a secondary tense, and so in this subordinate clause, starting with quod, we have imperfect subjunctive, so we're staying in secondary sequence. That's another thing to notice here. Number 9 is next. Una legio frumentatum missa erat. Una legio means one legion. Legio is feminine. Missa erat is a compound tense. It's passive and pluperfect. It means had been sent. If it were just missa est, it would mean was sent. But here we have missa erat, which puts it back even further into the pluperfect tense. So one legion had been sent. Notice also that missa is feminine because that's a gendered verb, and so it needs to match the grammatical gender of legio, which is feminine. And finally, we have the accusative supine, frumentatum. Mitto, which means to send, is a verb of motion, so we can have frumentatum here as an accusative supine expressing purpose. So one legion had been sent in order to collect grain. That's what frumentatum means. It's the verb frumentor, which is deponent. So one legion had been sent in order to collect grain. One legion had been sent for the purpose of collecting grain. Or a nice, smooth English translation, one legion had been sent to gather grain. Number 10 is next. Magna pars equitatus frumentandi causa missa est. The subject here is pars, that means part, and then missa est, it was sent. Here we have a perfect tense form, missa est. You can contrast that with the pluperfect form we saw in the previous exercise, missa erat versus missa est. It's a good comparison there. So the main skeleton of this sentence says, a part was sent. Pars is feminine, so missa needs to be feminine too. Magna pars means a great part. Notice that in Latin, adjectives of size or quantity come first. So instead of saying pars magna to say great part, we've got magna pars. Equitatus is a partitive genitive. That's the fourth declension noun equitatus, which means cavalry. And so with the macron over the U, that can be genitive singular. So magna pars equitatus says a great part of the cavalry. And again, missa est was sent. And then causa means for the sake. And then frumentandi is a gerund in the genitive. So frumentandi and causa together will say for the sake of gathering grain. So number 10 says, a great part of the cavalry was sent for the sake of gathering grain. Number 11 is next. Castra munire coiperunt, quo facilias hostium impetus sustenere possunt. This is the exercise I was mentioning earlier to show you how quo works here. Really, quo is just a relative pronoun in the ablative that has taken on sort of a conjunction role. So it's considered a conjunction, but really it's a relative pronoun. So quo will start a subordinate clause. Our main clause is castra munire coiperunt. Coiperunt is perfect tense. It means they began. And then munire is a complementary infinitive. That means to fortify. And then castra means camp. That's the direct object. So they began to fortify the camp. And then quo refers back to that activity of fortifying the camp. It refers to that whole thing, not simply just one word, but the entire activity of fortifying the camp. So quo says something like, by means of which activity, or by means of which doing. And then we have possent sustenere. They might be able. Possent is imperfect subjunctive of possum. So they might be able, sustenere, to withstand or sustain. And then impetus, with a macron over the U, that's the fourth declension noun, impetus, which means attack. Here, it's accusative plural. When you have a fourth declension noun like that, with a macron over the U, really it could be nominative plural, genitive singular, or accusative plural. So really you have to use the context to figure out what it is. Here, the context tells us that it's the direct object of sustenere. Facilius is a comparative adverb. So it means more easily. It's not describing a thing or an object. It's describing the activity of withstanding. So the idea is to withstand more easily the impetus hostium, the attacks of the enemies. So number 11, as a whole, will say something like this. They began to fortify the camp so that by this activity, they might be able to withstand more easily the attacks of the enemy. So quo here is referring back to that whole first clause. It's saying that by that activity, because of that activity, by means of that activity, as a result of that activity, they can withstand the attacks better. So how can we express that in English in a nice, smooth way? Well, we can use the word whereby. It's archaic, but, hey, it works. So let's translate quo as whereby and say they began to fortify the camp whereby they might be able to withstand the attacks of the enemy more easily. Number 12 is next. Castra moveri iubet, quo facilius hostibus timoris det suspicionem. Again, we have quo here working with a comparative, and that's facilius. Again, that's a comparative adverb. So quo and facilius are working together. Again, we have a main clause here, and then a subordinate clause starting with quo. So iubet says he, she, or it is commanding. And then we have an accusative infinitive kind of construction. Castra is accusative. And then moveri means to be moved. That's the passive present tense infinitive of the verb moveo, which means to move. So he is commanding the camp to be moved, or he is commanding that the camp be moved. If I had to analyze the grammar here, what I would say is that castra moveri is a noun clause acting as the direct object of iubet. I don't think this is classified as indirect speech. I think the grammarians classify this as something else. Verbs of commanding kind of get their own category in textbooks, I think. But regardless of how you break it down or analyze it, it means the same thing. He is commanding the camp to be moved, or he is commanding that the camp be moved. The sense is the same regardless of how you analyze it. Then we have quo facilius, that conjunction that we've been studying, quo, which is really a relative pronoun functioning as a kind of connecting conjunction. And here it's in its role of working with a comparative. So quo and facilius are working together to generate meaning. And we have a subjunctive verb here, det, That's a form of the verb do, which means give. Do is a first conjugation verb with some irregularities to it, but this is a fairly regular formation of the present tense subjunctive. So det means he, she, or it gives in the present tense, but it's subjunctive. There is no explicitly stated subject here, so I think we're still working with the same subject from the main clause, which I'm assuming is Julius Caesar. So starting from the beginning, he, meaning Julius Caesar, is commanding that the camp be moved, whereby more easily he might give. So we'll translate det as he can give, or he might give, translate quo as whereby, and then facilius, more easily. Again, that's a comparative adverb modifying the giving. Remember that an adverb modifies a verb, an adjective modifies a noun. So here we have facilius as an adverb, meaning more easily, modifying a verb. And what does he want to give? Suspicionem, which means suspicion, and then timoris means of fear. That's genitive singular of the noun timor from the third declension. And then hostibus is dative plural. That's the indirect object. He wants to give the suspicion of fear to the enemies. I think what this exercise is saying is that by moving the camp, he wants to make the enemy think that he's afraid. It's kind of a ruse or a trick. He wants to move the camp in order to plant the idea in the minds of the enemies that the Romans are afraid of them, and so do some kind of trickery or ruse like that. So let's take it from the top. He, meaning Julius Caesar, is commanding the camp to be moved, whereby more easily he might give the suspicion of fear to the enemy. Number 13 is next. Ad haec cognoscinda labienum esse idoneum arbitrabatur. There is no explicitly stated subject here, so we're going to be working with the pronoun in arbitrabatur. That's a form of the verb arbitror, which means to think, as in to suppose. So arbitrabatur is imperfect tense, so it's saying something like he, she, or it was thinking. That verb is going to kick off some indirect speech. Labienum is the subject accusative, esse is the infinitive within the indirect statement. Idoneum is an adjective modifying labienum, so it says, he was thinking that labienus was suitable. The infinitive verb in our indirect statement is in the present tense, so we'll put that in the same tense as the main verb. The main verb is in the past, arbitrabatur, so we'll translate esse as was. We'll say, he was thinking that labienus was suitable. So let's think about this statement here, labienum esse idoneum. That's indirect speech. If this were just a regular statement, not in indirect discourse, but just in regular direct discourse, it would be labienus est idoneus. Labienus is suitable. So in that kind of sentence, labienus would be the subject, est would be the verb, a linking verb or verb of being, and then idoneus would be a predicate adjective. And so we would construct idoneus in such a way where it matches labienus in case, number, and gender. We'd make it nominative singular and masculine to match labienus. So that's a predicate adjective in the nominative case. What I want you to notice here is that since we're in indirect discourse, the same thing happens. We need to put this adjective in the same case, number, and gender as labienus. Idoneum is a predicate adjective, but we're in indirect discourse. So instead of being nominative, it has to be accusative to match or agree with labienum. And so idoneum is a predicate adjective in the accusative case. And I'm just bringing this up so you can understand grammatically what's happening and so you know what to call things. I think that that kind of exercise increases your understanding and your depth of understanding of Latin grammar, giving you more of a solid understanding of what's happening. So he was thinking that labienus was suitable. Now we have a gerundive that's cognoscinda, and it's modifying haec, and then ad is setting it up to mean for the purpose of. So ad haec cognoscinda, those three words work together for the purpose of these things to be learned. So literally, ad haec cognoscinda, for the purpose of these things to be learned. That's not very good English. With that passive rendering of cognoscinda, it's not very clear when we render it into English. So what we do is we can make cognoscinda sound active. So we can say, for the purpose of learning, and then we make haec the object of that. So for the purpose of learning these things, and so that gives us this. He was thinking that labienus was suitable for the purpose of learning these things. Apparently, Caesar wants to send Labienus out, perhaps on a scouting mission or a diplomatic mission to figure out something, to get some intelligence to use on the battlefield. I don't know, but he was thinking that Labienus was suitable for the purpose of learning these things. He thought that Labienus was the right man for the job. Let's move on now to section 418. That's a new section of Julius Caesar for us to read. In this particular section, quick review, we have the Helvetii planning to burn all their stuff and do a mass exodus out of their homeland so that they have more space to spread out because they don't think that their homeland is big enough. This is all according to Julius Caesar. To my knowledge, he is really the only source we have for this material. So anyway, the Helvetii are planning to do a mass exodus out of their homeland, and along with that, we have this Helvetian nobleman named Orgetorix. And Orgetorix would very much like to seize power, and so Orgetorix has been doing some shady backroom deals with some other noblemen from other Gallic tribes. Orgetorix not only has his eye on the throne of the Helvetians, but also I think he has larger designs on some kind of larger kingly office that might be over all of Gaul. This is all according to Julius Caesar, of course. So in this section, we're going to read about Orgetorix and his backroom deals, his shady conspiring with other noblemen from other tribes. So why don't you go ahead and turn the recording off and try to do this on your own, and then when you're finished, turn the recording back on and we'll go over it together. Okay, let's go over our Julius Caesar passage together. In the first sentence we have, ad eas res conficiendas, Orgetorix deligatur. The subject is Orgetorix. Deligatur is the verb, that's third person singular, passive voice, present tense. And it means to choose or select. So Orgetorix is chosen or Orgetorix is selected. Then we have ad eas res conficiendas. This is very similar to one of our exercises. We have a gerundive here, conficiendas, it's modifying res. We have the demonstrative is ea id here in the accusative plural feminine, eos, and then ad means for the purpose of. So this says, for the purpose of these things to be accomplished. Again, res is the fifth declension noun that can mean thing. Of course, you're supposed to translate it with some more specific word and not just leave it as thing. And then conficiendas is the verb conficio, which means to finish accomplish, things like that. Why don't we just translate it as accomplish? And here it's in the form of a future passive participle, otherwise known as a gerundive, and it's modifying res. So res and conficiendas together say things to be accomplished, things that ought to be accomplished, things that need to be accomplished. So the first sentence says, Orgetorix is chosen for the purpose of these things to be accomplished. Now, for a smoother translation, we'll translate conficiendas as active. We'll say, for the purpose of accomplishing eas res, these things. And what are the things? What things are being referred to here? Well, if you'll recall, in our previous Caesar reading, we read about how the Helvetians were planning to buy up as many carts as they could and buy up as many animals that can pull those carts as they possibly could, and then to plant unusually large crops for the next 2 years. So they have lots of planning to do, lots of logistical work to do here to make this plan work. They have to buy lots of stuff. They have to do some agricultural planning to figure out how they're going to do their big plantings that they want to do. And so this nobleman, Orgetorix, is the guy that they choose to oversee this particular part of the plan, the logistical side, apparently. But apparently Orgetorix uses this role, this administrative role, and then using this role tries to pivot that into a power grab. And again, he does some shady backroom deals with some other aristocrats. But as far as this first sentence goes, it says, Orgetorix is chosen for the purpose of accomplishing these things. And the things are referring to the tasks of buying up stuff and doing big plantings. So we could translate res here as tasks, plans, undertakings. Why don't we say plans? We could translate it any of a number of ways, but plans sounds good because that's what they are. They're planning to do those things. So for the first sentence, let's say, Orgetorix is chosen for the purpose of accomplishing these plans. The next sentence, is sibi legationem ad civitates suscepit. The subject here is is, that's referring to Orgetorix. That's a form of is id, masculine nominative singular. And the verb here is suscepit. That's a form of the verb suscipio, which means to undertake. In fact, if you literally translate suscipio into English, that's what you get is undertake, because sus is really sub, which means under. The B in sub turns into an S due to assimilation. And then capit is really copio, to take. So literally undertake. So is and suscepit say, he undertook, and then legationem is the third declension noun legatio, which means a diplomatic team or a group of diplomats or perhaps an embassy. Perhaps we could say diplomatic mission. Ad civitates says to the states. That's not too hard. So he undertook a diplomatic mission to the states. Finally, we have the pronoun sibi, which is dative, and it means to him, to her, or to it. So along with is, it has the idea of Orgetorix undertook this for himself. There's a footnote here, footnote 4, that's referring us back to the section where they taught us about dative with compound verbs. But for me, even if it were not dative with compound verbs, the sibi would still make perfect sense because it could mean that he's undertaking it for himself, for his own benefit, or undertaking it under his control. It could be dative of reference. It could be dative of advantage. When I read the word sibi, I get the feeling that he's got his own plans of what he wants to accomplish with this delegation. So the way I would translate it into English is he undertook for himself, sibi, a delegation or diplomatic mission to the states. And by states, what we mean is the other tribes in Gaul, the other Gallic tribes. Moving on to the next sentence, we have, in eo itinere persuadet castico catamantaloidis filio sequano. In eo itinere means something like on this trip or on this journey. Persuadet is the verb persuadeo, which takes the dative case, and it's present tense, third person singular. So it says, he persuades Casticus. And then we have some more words telling us who Casticus is. The word filio here and the word sequano are called appositives, or we could say that they stand in apposition with castico. Remember that an appositive is just another noun that tells you what someone is or what something is. Like if someone says to you, hey, see that guy over there? That's Fred. He's a husband, a father, a construction worker. You're just saying nouns that the person is. You're just piling up nouns. Those are called appositives. And so that's what we have here. Filio means son. Catamantaloidis is a genitive of someone's name. That means of catamantaloides. And then sequano is an adjective that means that he is a Sequanian person, a member of the tribe known as the Sequani. By the way, this might be a good time to check the map. On the Lenny's Latin Class website, there's a page called Study Helps, and there I have some detailed maps that point things out to help you keep track of where the action is happening. Also, there are summaries of each book of Caesar's Gallic Wars in English, so you can read the summary and get a quick bird's eye view of what's happening action-wise or plot-wise. So you'll probably get more out of this as far as understanding the plot if you read the English summary there and look at the maps. Also, by the way, Google Maps is a great way to study locations. So lots of extra help there on the Study Helps page of the Lenny's Latin Class website. Okay, so filio and sequano are appositives. They stand in apposition with castico. Castico is dative because he's being persuaded. He's the person being persuaded by the verb persuadet. And so when you have another noun standing in apposition with castico, it has to agree with it in case, number, gender, all that stuff. So filio and sequano are dative singular masculine because castico is dative singular and masculine. So appositives have to agree with the thing that they are standing in apposition with. Another note here that I would like to mention, it says in eo itinere persuadet, and the subject of persuadet is orgeterix. So it would appear that orgeterix is not just sending some people to go and do a diplomatic mission or embassy. It seems like he's going along on the embassy himself. Like he's actually part of the delegation. If that's the case, that sheds a bit more light on what Sibi is doing on the first line. That he's undertaking himself, or he's undertaking for himself in the sense that he's part of it. That could be what's happening here. So anyway, it's not fully clear from the text, but what could be happening is that Orgeterix has put together a diplomatic detail or delegation, and then he sent it without himself as being part of it. Or it could be that he is actually part of the delegation, and so he's personally going around to some of these Gallic noblemen trying to talk them into doing some shady stuff. Let's move on to the next phrase here. Cuius pater regnum in sequanis multos annos obtenuerat. This is a relative clause, and it's starting with the relative pronoun cuius. Cuius is a relative pronoun in the genitive case. If we rattle off all the relative pronouns, we would say qui, quae, quod for nominative, and then cuius, cuius, cuius for genitive, and then qui, qui, qui for dative, so on and so forth. So this is a genitive relative pronoun, so we'll translate it as of whom, and it's going along with pater. So kouios and pater together say the father of whom, and it really seems to be talking about katamantaloides, the father of whom, in the sense of referring to katamantaloides, the father of katamantaloides, who would therefore be the grandfather of Costycus. So we have 3 generations here. And then we have the verb obtenuerat, which means to seize, to take possession of, or to hold. Here it probably means hold. Notice that multos annos is an accusative of extent of time. It's saying that something went on for many years. So regnum is the direct object of obtenuerat, and regnum means kingship, that is the office of king, the state of being king, not so much a place like a kingdom as a geographical place, but kingship as in the office of king or the right to be king. And so talking about Costycus's grandfather, or Katamantaloides' father, it says, obtenuerat regnum. He had seized the kingship, or he had held the kingship. So we'll translate obtenuerat, seeing as how it's pluperfect. We'll translate it as he had held the kingship, and then in sequanis, we'll say among the sequani. And again, multos annos is accusative of extent of time. So he had held the kingship among the sequani for many years. Obtenuerat is not just perfect tense. It's not saying that he held it. It's saying that he had held it. So since this is the grandfather of Costycus, he's probably dead by now. And so we're talking about action that was already completed at some remote past time. And so the pluperfect tense here feels right to say he had held it, a while back, before this or before that. For me, the use of the pluperfect here puts the activity of Costycus's grandfather being king, it puts it in a more remote time in the past. So that feels right to me. And it also tells us that his time as king is over, because pluperfect means that it was already completed at some time in the past. So they mention Costycus, then they mention Costycus's father, Katamantaloides, and then kouios refers to Katamantaloides, the father of whom, referring to Katamantaloides, held the kingship among the sequani for many years. So we have 3 generations, Costycus, his father, Katamantaloides, and then we have the father of Katamantaloides, whose name we don't know. But what we do know is that he was king of the sequani for a long time. And if we read between the lines here, what we can learn is that Costycus may have felt entitled to be the king of his tribe. So what could be happening here is that he's a disaffected nobleman who is not king, but feels as though he ought to be king, because he can look back and say, hey, my grandfather was king for many years, and kingship is hereditary, so my father should have been king, and now I should be king. So I'm speculating here. I can't prove any of this, but this is what it looks like. It looks as though Orgetorix, the Helvetian, is trying to do a power grab. He's been appointed to oversee preparations for the mass exodus of the Helvetians. And if you'll remember back, there was also a thing they were planning to do that said they wanted to establish peace with their neighboring tribes. So maybe Orgetorix is also in charge of that, and so that's why he's put together this diplomatic mission or this delegation. But anyway, it appears as though Orgetorix himself is part of the delegation, and he has gone to a disaffected nobleman of the tribe known as the Sequani and he's trying to persuade him of something. That's all we know at this point, but that's what it looks like. Orgetorix may have known that Casticus felt entitled, and so he might be a good guy to try to get to join in on some kind of conspiracy. That's what it looks like. Let's keep reading. Et a senatu populi Romani amicus appellatus erat. Still in the pluperfect tense, still talking about the father of Catamentaloides, who had been king for a long time. We don't know his name, but we know appellatus erat in the pluperfect. He had been named. That's the verb appello, which means to name someone or call someone something. And it's pluperfect passive. So the father of Catamentaloides, the king, he had been named, or he had been called. And what was he called? He was called a special title, amicus, which means friend. And who did the naming? It says that it was done a senatu. That means by the Senate. The word for Senate in Latin is the fourth declension noun, senatus. And so in the ablative, it's senatu. So appellatus erat a senatu says he had been named by the Senate. And then populi Romani is genitive. That means of the Roman people. It looks like it's possessing the Senate. So it's by the Senate of the Roman people. I guess it could be possessing amicus. It could be saying friend of the Roman people. I just checked a translation, and it does seem to go with the Senate. So it's by the Senate of the Roman people. Amicus is a special diplomatic title that the Roman Senate could bestow on certain people. And so apparently the Roman Senate had bestowed this special title upon the father of Catamentaloides. The father of Catamentaloides, the grandfather of Casticus, this guy was an important guy. He was an ally of Rome. He had been granted a special diplomatic title by Rome. He had been king for many years. So that's who Casticus's ancestors are. His grandfather was king and a very important guy. Fast forwarding back to the present, within the story that is, Orgetorix has come to this guy, Casticus, and he's trying to talk him into something. And the next part of it is going to tell us exactly what he was trying to talk him into. So let's continue reading, and we'll find out more about what's happening here with these sketchy backroom deals. So the next thing we have here is ut regnum. And so this is working with what came a few lines before on line 2 and 3, where it says persuadet Casticus. Orgetorix is trying to persuade Casticus, and now we find out what he's trying to persuade him to do. So we have ut, and then we have occuparet. Let's read it. It says, ut regnum in civitate sua occuparet. This is an indirect command. So going back to persuadet and castico, it says here, he is persuading Casticus, and now we jump down to ut, persuading him that he take the kingship in his own state, in civitate sua. So occupo can mean things like take possession of, seize, occupy. Here it probably means seize or grab. Persuadet and then castico, then we jump to ut. Okay, so he's persuading Casticus that he seize the kingship, occuparet regnum, in civitate sua. Now in this subordinate clause, we have a verb in the imperfect subjunctive, which is a secondary tense. But our main verb, persuadet, is present tense, which is a primary tense. So what's going on here? Do we have Julius Caesar making a mistake in his Latin composition? No. Caesar is widely recognized as being a great stylist of Latin writing, and so he's not making a mistake here. Instead, what's happening is that persuadet is telling us about past events using present tense verbs to make it sound more exciting. So that's what we call historical present. And so the present tense here is being used as a past tense. And therefore, in that context, it can be viewed as a secondary tense. Persuadet is historical present, talking about past events. So it's considered a secondary tense. And then occuparet is imperfect subjunctive, which is also a secondary tense. So we are, in fact, in secondary sequence here. The next section says, quod pater ante habuerat. So Orgetorix is persuading Casticus that he sees the kingship in his own state. And then quod is a relative pronoun referring back to regnum. We have a relative clause here. Pater means father. Habuerat is pluperfect. It means he had held. And then ante means before. So it says, which father had held before, meaning his father, referring to not the father of Catamentaloidus, but the father of Casticus. So he persuades Casticus that he sees the kingship in his own state, the kingship which his father had held before. So here it appears that both the father of Catamentaloidus had been king, and Catamentaloidus also had been king. So it appears that Casticus's grandfather and father had both been king, but judging from the context, it would seem that Casticus is not king. But it says, quod pater ante habuerat, which his father had held. So that's the pluperfect tense, saying that the action was completed at some past time. So what that tells us is that Casticus's father is no longer king. And again, if we read between the lines, it seems that Casticus is not king. So why is he not king if his grandfather and father were king? Why did he not inherit the throne? Again, it could be that Casticus is a disaffected nobleman who feels entitled to the throne. And so Orgetorix is being manipulative here. He's trying to manipulate Casticus into doing sort of a coup attempt to become king of his own state, the Sequani. That's sure what it looks like. How this helps Orgetorix, I don't know, but probably Orgetorix has some kind of plan to make allies in different places and do a huge revolution, not only in his own tribe, the Helvetii, but throughout Gaul. Continuing on, we have itemque domnorigi haeduo fratri duiciaci. So we have some dative words here. Domnorigi is Dumnorix. That's someone's name, and it's in the dative case. That's a third declension name. So the long I there at the end indicates dative singular. Why would it be dative? It's working still with persuadet. You might say it's being governed by persuadet, or it's being affected by persuadet. He could have put the word persuadet in yet again. Itemque means something like likewise. So he could have said, itemque persuadet Dumnorigi. Likewise, he persuades Dumnorix. But he chose not to put in the word persuadet again. We just have to read it into the text. I guess you could say it's understood here. In fact, the footnote even tells us that. It says to read Dumnorigi with persuadet. So we still have this situation here where Orgetorix is persuading people. First, he tried to persuade Casticus to seize the throne of the Sequani because his grandfather was king and his father was king. Now, itemque domnorigi. Likewise, he persuades Dumnorix. And haeduo means Haeduin. That is a member of the Haedui tribe. That's dative singular because it's modifying Dumnorigi, which is dative singular. Fratri duiciaci, that says the brother of Duiciacus. Fratri is standing in apposition with Dumnorigi. Fratri is dative singular, just like dumnorigi. Dumnorigi is dative singular because it's the object of persuadet, which takes the dative. And so in order to stand in apposition with dumnorigi, the word fratri has to be dative singular and masculine. Duikiaki, however, is not dative. That is genitive singular of the name Duikiakos, which I believe is second declension. So this whole little clause here would say, likewise, he persuades Dumnorix the Haiduan, the brother of Duikiakos. Now the Haidui, that tribe, is allied with Rome. Or, well, at least they're supposed to be allied with Rome. But we're going to find out soon that Dumnorix is kind of a troublemaker, and he doesn't really want to go along with it. Duikiakos ends up trying to patch up things with Julius Caesar. He tries to defend his brother Dumnorix after his brother does some rather dangerous and treasonous things. So Dumnorix and Duikiakos are brothers, aristocrats, members of the Haidui tribe, which is allied with Rome. In most texts, you see it spelled without the H. You just see it as Idui. I don't fully know why they spell it with an H here and say Haidui. But anyway, Haidui is the same as Idui. Either way, I don't think the H was pronounced very strongly at the beginning of a word, so it probably sounded something like Idui anyway. Okay, moving on, we have qui eo tempore principatum in civitate obtenebat. Now we're talking about Duikiakos. Okay, we have two brothers, Dumnorix and Duikiakos. Orgetorix is trying to persuade the less powerful brother, Dumnorix, who's the brother of the more powerful Duikiakos. And then it tells us about him, Duikiakos, who, at that time, eo tempore, obtenebat, that's imperfect tense, it says he was holding, and then principatum means the state of being first, the state of being chief, being leader, sovereign, something like that. Principatum here, I think, is referring to the office of chief of the state. So we could translate it as sovereignty. Okay, so we're talking about Duikiakos, the more powerful brother of Dumnorix. So Duikiakos, who, at that time, eo tempore, it's an ablative of time when, at that time, was holding the sovereignty. And then in civitate says in the state, or in their state, or perhaps in his state. We'll throw in the word his because it's understood. Okay, so Duikiakos is the more powerful brother. He is the sovereign. They don't call him king for some reason. Maybe the Haidui were trying to copy Roman styles of government, and they had gone to some other form of government. I don't know, but they don't say he was holding the regnum. They say he was holding the principatum. So maybe he was some kind of magistrate, like a president, perhaps, or a consul. We don't know. So Duikiakos is basically the president of the Haidui, and he has a brother, probably a younger brother, named Dumnorix, who has less power. He may be a disaffected noble who thinks he ought to have more power. And furthermore, Orgetorix is trying to persuade him of things. Let's continue reading. Ac maxime plebi acceptus arat. Ac is an abbreviation for atque. It just means and, or perhaps and also. And we're still talking about Duikiakos here, the more powerful brother. Erat is the verb he was, and acceptus means something like popular. Acceptus is the fourth principal part of the verb accipio, which means to receive, accept. So it's related to our English word accept. So Duikiakos acceptus erat, he was popular. And then maxime is an adverb that means the greatest or in the greatest fashion. It's an adverb. Or most greatly. So he was most greatly popular. And then plebe means to the plebs in the sense of the common people. Among the ancient Romans, we have these different social classes. We have aristocrats. We have the common people known as the plebs. And then we have sort of a middle class known as the equitates, or in English, we might say equestrians, the equestrian class. That's related to the word for horse. The word for horse is equus. And so the idea is that equestrians were wealthy enough to own enough property to have a horse. Keep in mind that to own a horse in the ancient world, it took a lot of resources. You had to have land for the horse to live on. You had to have a barn to put it in, and you had to have perhaps farmland to grow food for it, which would imply that you're a landowner. And so to be a knight, K-N-I-G-H-T, that's what an equestrian is, means a knight in the sense of someone who owns a horse. To have a horse, to have the land needed for a horse, that meant you had a certain social status. And so that's why that class, that social class, is called equites, or equestrians, because it's associated with horse ownership. So in ancient Rome, you have social classes. Caesar is using those Roman social classes to describe a social situation among the haidui. He says that Doukiakos was akeptos erat, that he was popular, plebe, to the plebs, that is the common people, the people who were not nobles, not aristocrats, just the regular people. So put it all together, and we could say maxime akeptos erat. We could say something like he was extremely popular among the plebs, or to the plebs, or simply among the people, or something like that. And now we have another ut clause. Watch carefully what happens next. Ut idem conaretur persuadet. Here we have persuadet again. Instead of just leaving it as understood, for clarity, Caesar throws it in again. So persuadet, it's he, she, or it is persuading, but who's persuading whom? It's still Orgetorix from line 1. He's still trying to persuade people of things. And who is being persuaded? Dumnorix. Again, we have two brothers, Dumnorix and Doukiakos. Doukiakos is the more powerful of the two. These are aristocrats of the haidui tribe. Dumnorix is probably his younger brother, who is the less powerful of the two. And Orgetorix is trying to persuade him to do some shady, sketchy stuff. Persuadet, he persuades Dumnorix, ut idem conaretur. It's a result clause telling us what he's trying to persuade him to do. He's persuading him that he try, conaretur, that's a form of conor, the deponent verb that means try or attempt. He persuades that he try, and then we have idem, which means the same thing. So what does it mean when it says that Orgetorix persuades Dumnorix to try the same thing? What's the same thing referring to? It's talking about the same thing that he tried to talk Casticus into, trying to seize the throne. So for some reason, Orgetorix is trying to persuade Casticus to stage a coup and seize the kingship among the Sequani, and he's trying to persuade Dumnorix, the Haiduan, to do the same thing. Now remember, Dumnorix is not in charge. His older brother, Doukiakos, is in charge. He's basically the president of the haidui. It says that he holds the principatum. So basically, what Orgetorix is trying to do, he's trying to get Dumnorix to overthrow his brother, Doukiakos. He's trying to set one brother against the other. Maybe Dumnorix feels like he got the shaft, like he should have gotten political power but didn't, and so he's disaffected and wants to get rid of his brother. So there's some serious political intrigue going on here. and it's all coming from Orgetorix. Orgetorix is really trying to manipulate the situation and get some disaffected nobles who feel that they deserve power. He's trying to get them to stage coups in their states. So this is really a big deal. And then in the last line, we see a move that Orgetorix makes to try to firm up his connections with Dumnorix, the younger brother of Duikiacus. It says, Eique filiam suam in matrimonium dat. Dat is a form of do, which means give. It's present tense, third person singular. So it means he, she, or it gives. And then ae is a dative singular form of is, ea, id. So ae means to him in the sense of to Dumnorix. Remember, the dative singular of is, ea, id is not ao, it's ae. Okay, so he gives to him, meaning to Dumnorix, filiam suam, his own daughter, in matrimonium. That means into marriage. Again, this is historical present. Dot is present tense, but it's talking about past events. So Orgetorix is the subject of dot. Orgetorix, the Helvetian nobleman, he gives his own daughter to be the wife of Dumnorix to establish a connection between them. So this last line says, and he gives to him his own daughter in marriage. One last quick note before we go. This passage of Julius Caesar, of Caesar's Gallic Wars, is a perfect example of how you really have to pay attention to the case endings to figure out who is doing what. On line 3, it's possible to misunderstand cuius and think it's referring to Casticus when it's really referring to Catamanteloidus. Then we have lots of words like sua. It's easy to misunderstand who the sua is referring to. Who does something belong to? The relative pronoun qui on line 7, it's easy to misunderstand that that might be talking about Dumnorix, but it's really talking about Duikiacus. And then on the last 2 lines, we don't have explicit declarations of who persuadet is talking about, who dot is referring to, and who ae is referring to. We just have to use the context. And so this is a perfect example of how you really have to pay attention to the context and the case endings and the pronouns to really know who is being referred to. So in a passage like this, you really have to put on your thinking cap and pay attention and really keep track of who is being referred to by these various pronouns, relative pronouns, forms of issa id, different adjectives of possession like suus, suasuum. You just really have to pay attention, and you can't just go on autopilot. You really have to put on your thinking cap and focus to avoid making an error based on a misunderstanding. So it doesn't happen on its own. It happens with lots of practice and intentionality. So keep working hard on this. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you again next time in the next installment of Lenny's Latin class.